Before the sun ever touched the hills, Caleb Morgan's quiet life changed with a sound he would never forget. It came just after the storm had passed, when the old rescue room behind his house still smelled of wet cedar, muddy boots, and cold rain. The power flickered once, then steadied. Outside, Texas Hill Country lay dark and broken beneath the last scraps of thunder, with mesquite branches bent low and red clay washing in thin rivers across the yard. Caleb had barely slept. At 47, he was used to restless nights, but this one felt different. The storm had rattled the windows for hours, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the emergency sirens had come and gone like ghosts. He told himself the worst was over. Then something heavy pushed against his back door. Not a knock, not a scratch, a slow, deliberate shove. Caleb opened his eyes in the darkness and held his breath. For a few seconds, the only sound was rain dripping from the roof gutters. Then it came again, a dull thud against the lower part of the door, followed by a rough drag, as if some large animal had leaned its weight into the wood and nearly given up. He sat up on the edge of the bed. "No," he whispered to himself, "not tonight." He reached for the flashlight on his nightstand, pulled on an old flannel shirt, and moved through the narrow hallway toward the back of the house. The old rescue room had not been used properly in years, not since Caleb walked away from full-time wildlife rescue after the accident. Still, he kept supplies there out of habit. Bandages, heat blankets, gloves, things he told himself he would probably never need again. Another push hit the door. This time, it was followed by a low sound from outside, deep enough to make the floorboards feel alive beneath his feet. Caleb froze. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, months earlier, when a wounded lion had been trapped near the south fence of the private sanctuary beyond the ridge. A dark-maned male, exhausted and furious, with a coil of torn wire digging into his front leg. Everyone else had wanted to wait for a dart team. Caleb had not waited. He had spoken softly, moved slowly, and somehow lived long enough to cut that wire free. The lion's name was Atlas. Caleb stepped closer to the door, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. "That better not be who I think it is," he muttered. He unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just 2 inches. Cold rain air slipped inside, and there, standing beneath the weak porch light, was Atlas. The full-grown lion looked larger than memory, his dark mane soaked flat against his neck, his golden eyes fixed on Caleb with a tiredness that did not belong on anything wild. Mud streaked his legs. A fresh scrape marked one shoulder. Rainwater dripped from his whiskers, but he did not shake it off. He did not roar. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, breathing hard. Caleb's throat tightened. "Atlas," he said quietly, "what in God's name happened to you?" The lion lowered his head. At first, Caleb thought it was weakness. Then Atlas shifted his weight and looked down behind his front legs. Caleb followed his gaze with the flashlight. 2 tiny shapes huddled in the red mud. Lion cubs. They were so small they seemed almost unreal beside their father's massive paws. One pressed itself against Atlas's leg, trembling so hard its little shoulders shook. The other tried to lift its head but failed, its wet fur clinging to its thin body, its breathing fast and uneven. Caleb forgot to breathe. "Oh, Lord," he whispered. "You brought them here." Atlas did not move, but his eyes stayed on Caleb, steady and desperate, as if every mile of that storm-broken night had led to this one door. Caleb opened it wider. The stronger cub stumbled first, slipping on the wet porch boards before crawling over the threshold. The second cub did not follow. It only shivered, too tired to understand warmth was inches away. Caleb slowly crouched, one hand out, careful not to reach too fast. Atlas watched every movement. One wrong gesture, One careless step, and Caleb knew the animal before him could become nothing but instinct. But Atlas did something Caleb never expected. He nudged the weaker cub forward with his nose. Not toward himself, toward Caleb. The meaning of it settled into the room heavier than thunder. Help him. Caleb swallowed hard and slid a folded emergency blanket across the floor. The first cub crawled onto it, letting out a small, broken sound. Caleb gently lifted the weaker one, feeling how cold its body was through the damp fur. Its heartbeat fluttered against his palm like a trapped bird. "I've got you," he murmured. "Easy now. You're safe." Atlas stepped inside last. He did not explore the room. He did not collapse by the heater. He turned in a slow circle, checked the windows, checked Caleb, checked the cubs, and then lowered himself across the doorway like a living wall between his children and the dark outside. Only then did Caleb notice the smell. Not just mud, not just rain. There was a sharp metallic stink in Atlas's mane, mixed with wet grass and something burned, like an electric fence shorted out in standing water. Caleb looked at the lion's scraped shoulder, then at the mud packed around the cubs' bellies. Whatever had happened at the sanctuary, it had not been simple. He turned on the old space heater and pulled more towels from the cabinet. The stronger cub, as if deciding it had survived enough terror for one night, wobbled away from the blanket and bumped headfirst into a box of medical gloves. The box tipped, scattering blue gloves across the floor. The cub blinked at the mess, then pawed at one as though it had discovered a strange new animal. Despite everything, Caleb let out a tired breath that almost became a laugh. "You're already trouble, aren't you?" The weaker cub did not move. It lay curled in the blanket, eyes half closed, sides rising too quickly. Caleb's smile faded. He knelt beside it, brushing 2 fingers gently over its wet head. "Hang on, little one." Atlas lifted his head at the sound of Caleb's voice. His eyes moved from the weak cub to Caleb, then toward the window facing the ridge. Outside, the storm had quieted, but the land had not. Somewhere far off, metal creaked in the wind. Something loose, something broken. Then Atlas's ears rose. His whole body changed. The tired father at the door became alert, rigid, listening. The stronger cub stopped playing. The weaker one gave a faint, frightened chirp. Caleb followed Atlas's stare into the darkness beyond the rain-streaked glass. He could not see anything, but Atlas could. And in that moment, Caleb understood with a cold certainty that the 2 cubs on his floor were not the end of whatever had come out of that storm. They were only the beginning. Atlas kept staring through the rain-streaked window as if the darkness itself had called his name. Caleb stood beside the heater with a towel in one hand and the weaker cub tucked close to his chest. The little thing had stopped shivering quite so violently, but its breathing was still too fast, too shallow. Every few seconds, its tiny mouth opened as though it was trying to pull more warmth out of the room. The stronger cub had found Caleb's rubber boot near the cabinet and shoved half its body inside. Its back legs kicked helplessly against the floor, making small squeaking sounds that would have been funny on any other morning. But Caleb could not laugh for long. Not with Atlas lying across the door. Not with that smell of burnt metal still clinging to his mane. Not with the storm-dark hills beyond the glass hiding whatever had driven a lion father to a human home before sunrise. Caleb set the weak cub carefully into the emergency blanket and reached for his phone. "Grace," he said when the call connected. "I need you here." A tired woman's voice answered, rough with sleep. "Caleb Morgan, if this is about a raccoon in your feed bin again, I swear, it's Atlas." Silence. Then Grace Miller's voice changed completely. "Atlas the lion? He's in my rescue room." Another pause. "Caleb, he brought cubs." The line went quiet long enough for Caleb to hear rain ticking off the window frame. "How many?" Grace asked. "2. And you're still alive?" "For now. I'm on my way." 25 minutes later, headlights washed across the muddy yard. Atlas rose before the tires even stopped. His shoulders lifted, mane dark and heavy, body blocking the cubs from the door. Caleb stepped between him and the entryway, one hand raised low. "Easy, big guy. She's a friend." Grace Miller came in slowly, wrapped in a raincoat, her gray hair tucked under a wool cap and a medical bag clutched in one hand. She stopped just inside the room. Her eyes moved from Atlas to the cubs, then back to Caleb. "Oh, mercy," she whispered. "You weren't exaggerating. I wish I had been." Grace did not rush toward the cubs. She knew better. She lowered herself onto one knee and let Atlas see every movement. The lion watched her with a hard, exhausted focus. His tail flicked once against the floor. Grace looked at Caleb. "Has he eaten? Drunk?" "No. He won't move from the door." "That's not stubbornness," she said softly. "That's fear." Together, they checked the cubs without forcing anything. The stronger one finally backed out of Caleb's boot with a muffled squeak and tumbled onto its side, offended by its own escape. Grace almost smiled, but the expression faded when she touched the weaker cub's belly. Cold, dehydrated, breathing too fast. She parted the damp fur gently. "And look here." Caleb leaned closer. A raw line crossed the cub's side, not deep, but angry and red. "Wire?" he asked. "Or fencing? Maybe storm debris." Grace's face tightened. They didn't just wander away from their mother. Something pushed them through something they never should have been near. At the word mother, Atlas made a sound. Not a roar, not even a growl. A low, broken rumble rolled from his chest and faded almost as soon as it began. Caleb looked at him. Grace did too. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the mesquite trees with a long, wet hiss. Grace opened a small bottle of electrolyte solution and dipped a cloth into it. If the south fence washed out last night, the sanctuary could be a mess. Flooded pens, downed wire, frightened animals scattered everywhere. Caleb looked toward the window. The preserve was supposed to move the pride before the storm hit. "Supposed to," Grace said quietly. "Doesn't always mean did." The stronger cub crawled toward Atlas and pressed its head against his front paw. Atlas lowered his massive face and touched the cub so gently Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. The lion's eyes closed for half a second, but only half. Even in exhaustion, he would not fully rest. Then it came, a thin cry outside, so faint Caleb almost thought it was the wind. The cub near Atlas lifted its head and answered with a tiny chirp. Atlas stood. The movement was sudden enough that Grace froze with the cloth still in her hand. Caleb felt every muscle in his own body lock. Atlas stepped to the door and looked back once, straight at Caleb. "No," Caleb whispered. "Atlas." The lion did not blink. Grace's voice dropped low. "Let him show us." Caleb moved to the door, heart hammering. "If I open this and you run, I don't know if I can help you." Atlas pressed his shoulder lightly against the wood. Caleb opened it. Cold rain swept in. Atlas slipped through the gap and disappeared into the gray-black yard. The room fell into a silence so tense it seemed to press against Caleb's ears. Grace wrapped the two cubs closer to the heater while Caleb stood in the doorway, flashlight raised, watching the darkness. 1 minute passed, then 2. "Come on," Caleb breathed. "Come on, big guy." First, all he saw was rain. Then a shape moved beyond the mesquite. Atlas came back slowly, head low, body swaying with fatigue. Behind him stumbled one cub, then another, then a third. Caleb's hand tightened on the doorframe. The first was limping. The second was so covered in red mud it looked like a piece of the storm had grown legs. The smallest did not walk at all. Atlas carried it gently by the scruff, crossed the porch, and placed it at Caleb's feet as if laying down the last thing in the world he still had strength to protect. Caleb stared. "No," he whispered. "Atlas, no. That's 5. Grace stood behind him, one hand over her mouth. "You brought 5 cubs?" The cubs inside began chirping, and the muddy newcomers answered in weak, scattered cries. The rescue room filled with tiny voices, wet paws, trembling bodies, and the deep, worn breathing of a father who had gone back into the storm because leaving them behind had never been an option. Grace's eyes shone in the heater light. "He's not looking for shelter anymore," she said softly. "He's evacuating his family." Caleb stepped aside as Atlas nudged the new cubs into the room. One rolled straight into a pile of towels. Another grabbed the end of Grace's stethoscope and tugged it with surprising determination. The limping cub tried to climb Caleb's leg and slid back down, blinking in confusion. Caleb let out a helpless, shaky laugh. "I couldn't handle 2, he murmured. "Now I've got 5 tiny lions redecorating my life." But Atlas did not join the warmth. He stood in the open doorway, soaked and trembling, staring past Caleb into the storm. Grace saw it too. Her smile faded. "Caleb," she whispered. Atlas's ears lifted again, and Caleb felt the hope drain out of him. Because even after bringing 5 cubs to safety, the lion father still would not lie down. Something else was out there. For a few minutes, the old rescue room became a storm of tiny paws. 5 lion cubs moved across the floor in every direction at once. Too cold to settle and too frightened to understand they were safe. One nosed into a stack of towels and vanished beneath them. Another tugged at Grace's stethoscope until the earpieces scraped across the concrete. The limping cub tried twice to climb Caleb's pant leg, failed both times, and sat there blinking as if the whole world had betrayed it. Caleb should have smiled. Instead, his eyes stayed on Atlas. The lion father stood in the open doorway, rain dripping from his mane, chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. He had brought 5 cubs out of the storm, yet he still would not come inside. His gaze remained fixed beyond the yard, toward the washed-out darkness below the ridge. Grace wrapped the smallest muddy cub in a dry towel. "He's running on nothing but instinct now." Caleb nodded. "And fear." Before Grace could answer, blue and red light flashed across the wet windows. Atlas turned sharply. The cubs scattered. A sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop beyond the gate, tires sinking slightly into the mud. A man stepped out in a rain jacket, one hand near the equipment belt at his waist. Caleb recognized him even before he reached the porch. Deputy Owen Harris. "Caleb," Owen called through the rain. "Tell me what I heard isn't true." Caleb stepped outside just far enough to keep Atlas behind him. "Depends what you heard. I heard there's a full-grown lion on your property." "That part's true." Owen's eyes hardened. "Then we have a serious problem." Behind Caleb, Atlas gave a low rumble. Not loud, not threatening, but enough to make Owen stop walking. Grace appeared in the doorway. "Owen, put your hand down. I'm not here to hurt anything," he said, though his hand stayed near the tranquilizer pistol clipped at his side. "But if that lion gets near the road, I have to protect people." "He came here with cubs," Grace said. Owen looked past Caleb and finally saw them. 5 soaked, trembling cubs clustered near the heater, their tiny faces turned toward the door. His expression shifted, but only for a second. "Grace," he said quietly, That makes this more dangerous, not less. The lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the room went black. Every cub cried at the same time. Caleb spun around. "Grace, I've got the flashlight," she said. But her voice was already strained. A metal pan clattered somewhere in the dark. One cub bolted under the table. Another slid into the towel pile. Atlas lunged forward, not at anyone, but toward the cries, trying to gather his children by sound alone. Then came a thinner cry, farther away, from the storage closet. Caleb swept his flashlight across the room and counted fast. 1 by the heater, 2 under the table, 3 in the towels. For against Atlas's paw, his stomach dropped. "Where's the little muddy one?" A weak chirp answered from behind the half-open closet door. Caleb yanked it wider. Inside was a cramped storage room packed with old rescue gear. Extension cords, metal crates, cracked buckets, and a floor drain that led beneath the building. The smallest cub had crawled in and slipped behind a fallen crate, its little body wedged beside a coil of wet electrical cable. Atlas pushed toward the closet, but he was far too large to enter. His mane brushed the doorframe. A desperate growl rolled out of him, shaking dust from the shelves. Owen raised the tranquilizer pistol. "Don't," Grace snapped. "He's agitated. He's a father," she said. "There's a difference." Caleb dropped to his knees. "Atlas, stay back." The lion's golden eyes locked on him. For one terrifying second, Caleb was back in the accident years ago. A trapped animal, a wrong move, a scream, blood on wet ground, and the feeling that no amount of good intentions could undo one bad moment. Then the cub cried again. Caleb crawled into the closet. The space was tight, cold, and cluttered. His shoulder struck a metal shelf. His hand slid through muddy water. The cub was just out of reach, shivering near the drain, one paw tangled in cable. "Easy, baby," Caleb whispered. "Don't move." Behind him, Atlas breathed hard, hot and panicked, filling the doorway like a storm-given flesh. Caleb stretched farther. His fingers caught the cub's wet fur, then slipped. The cub slid closer to the drain. "No, no, no." He lunged, grabbed the loose skin at the back of its neck with one hand and freed the tiny paw with the other. The cub let out a sharp cry, but Caleb pulled it against his chest and backed out of the closet. Atlas surged forward. Owen lifted the pistol again. Caleb froze with the cub in his arms. The lion's face came within inches of his own. Caleb could see rainwater on the whiskers, mud under the chin, fear blazing beneath all that power. "Easy," Caleb whispered. "I've got him." Atlas lowered his head. He touched his nose to the cub first, breathing it in. Then, slowly, he touched that same nose against Caleb's hand. Owen's arm lowered. No one spoke. Grace took the cub from Caleb and wrapped it tight. "That," she said softly, "was trust." But Atlas did not rest. Even after the cub was safe, even after the power flickered back and the heater groaned alive again, he turned toward the door. Grace saw it and went pale. "No." Caleb looked at her. She swallowed. "He can't still have more out there." Atlas stared at Caleb. The room seemed to tilt beneath him. "Atlas," Caleb said, voice barely holding. "Don't tell me there are more." The lion stepped into the rain. Owen moved as if to stop him, but Grace caught his sleeve. "If you stop him now, whatever is out there dies." So they waited. The storm had softened, but every second felt longer than the last. Caleb stood in the doorway, mud on his knees, blood from a small scrape drying across his knuckles. Then Atlas emerged from the dark again. This time he was dragging something, a torn section of netting, tangled with brush, wire, and red clay. It scraped across the porch with a wet, awful sound. Inside it were two cubs. One cried weakly. The other did not move. Caleb rushed forward. Grace! Together they cut and pulled until the net came loose. Grace lifted the silent cub, pressed 2 fingers to its tiny chest, and waited. 1 second. 2. Then the cub coughed. A thin, broken breath filled its lungs. Grace closed her eyes. Thank God! Caleb looked from the 2 rescued cubs to the 5 inside. 7, he breathed. Grace, that's 7 lion cubs. Atlas stood over them, swaying on his feet. Grace looked at the exhausted father, her eyes wet. He went back for every last one. Owen's radio crackled before anyone could answer. A voice broke through the static. Deputy Harris, patrol found a damaged south fence near the drainage ditch. Possible adult female lion trapped below the washout. Repeat, possible adult female still alive. Caleb went still. Grace turned toward Atlas. The lion father lifted his head toward the ridge, and for the first time that night, Caleb understood why he had not allowed himself to collapse. The cubs were safe, but their mother was still out there. For a moment, no one in the rescue room moved. The radio hissed in Owen Harris's hand, but the words had already done their damage. A possible adult female lion, trapped near the south fence. Still alive. Somewhere beyond the wet hills, beyond the broken mesquite and the flooded wash, the mother of those 7 cubs might be lying in the mud, waiting for a help she had no reason to believe would come. Atlas knew. Caleb saw it in the way the lion lifted his head toward the ridge. Not with surprise, not with confusion, with a terrible, exhausted certainty. He had saved the cubs first. Now he was asking for the rest of his family. Grace looked at Caleb. That has to be Nala. The name settled heavily in the room. Caleb remembered her from the sanctuary reports. A pale gold lioness with quiet eyes and a habit of keeping the cubs tucked close to the limestone rocks on the south side. If the storm had torn that area apart, she might have held the line long enough for Atlas to move the cubs one by one. And now she was the one left behind. Caleb looked down at his hands. They were muddy, scratched, shaking. The old fear rose fast. Years ago, in another rescue, another trapped animal had panicked at the wrong second. Caleb still remembered the sound his friend made when the cat struck. He remembered the ambulance lights, the hospital hallway, the quiet knowledge that courage did not always save everyone. Since then, Caleb had kept his distance from moments like this. He advised. He stored supplies. He answered calls when he could. But he did not crawl back into danger. Not anymore. Atlas stepped toward him. The lion's massive body swayed with fatigue, but he stayed upright. 7 cubs lay behind him, wrapped in towels and heat, their tiny bodies breathing because he had refused to quit. Atlas looked at Caleb, and there was no command in his eyes, only trust. Grace's voice softened. You don't have to be fearless, Caleb. He turned toward her. You just have to be useful. Something in him steadied. Caleb took a slow breath, then grabbed his rain jacket from the hook. Owen, get your spotlight. Grace, bring the kit. Owen stared at him. You're really going out there with him? Caleb looked at Atlas. He brought every one of those cubs back. I'm not letting him finish this alone. They left the cubs in the heated room, bundled together beneath Grace's spare blankets. Atlas paused at the doorway, looking back once. The smallest cub gave a weak little cry. Atlas answered with a low chuff, then stepped into the rain. He led them through the washed-out yard and down toward the sanctuary fence line. The road had become a river of red mud. Branches lay twisted across the path. A section of electric fencing sagged into the wet grass, dead and useless after the storm. Atlas moved slower now. Twice he stumbled. Twice he forced himself onward. Owen walked behind with the spotlight. The hard edge in his face had faded. He was no longer following a threat. He was following a father. Near the drainage ditch, Atlas stopped. From below came a low, broken growl. Caleb aimed his flashlight down. Nala was there. The lioness lay half in the muddy water, her rear leg caught beneath a bent metal brace from the collapsed fence. Her fur was soaked. Her ribs rose and fell in painful waves. When the light touched her face, she tried to lift her head and failed. Atlas made a sound so soft Caleb nearly missed it. Nala answered. Grace knelt at the edge. She's exhausted. If we don't free that leg, she won't make it till morning. Caleb slid down into the ditch before he could talk himself out of it. Mud swallowed his boots. Cold water soaked through his jeans. Nala's eyes locked on him, wild with pain and fear. Easy girl, he whispered. I'm not here to take anything from you. Grace handed him the cutter. Owen held the light steady from above. The first cut snapped through a strip of twisted wire. Nala flinched and growled. Atlas surged forward, every instinct in him waking at once. Owen's hand went to the tranquilizer pistol. Caleb looked up sharply. Atlas, stay. The lion froze. Rain ran down his mane. His muscles trembled. His mate was hurt. A man was inches from her wound. Every wild law in his blood told him to move, but he did not. He trusted Caleb. Caleb turned back to the brace and worked the cutter around the final piece of metal. His fingers were numb. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it over the rain. One more, Grace said. Slow. The brace gave way. Nala's legs slipped free. She collapsed with a deep, shuddering breath. Atlas stepped down carefully and pressed his forehead to hers. For several seconds, the two lions stayed that way in the ditch, rain falling over them, neither strong enough to do more than breathe. Owen lowered the pistol completely. I've never seen anything like this, he said. No, Caleb answered softly. Neither have I. Getting Nala back took every bit of strength they had. Grace wrapped the injured leg. Owen cleared branches from the path. Caleb walked beside Atlas, guiding him when exhaustion made his steps uneven. By the time they reached the rescue room, the sky had begun to pale. The moment Nala entered, 7 small heads lifted. One cub cried, then all of them did. They crawled, stumbled, and tumbled toward her in a messy little wave. Nala lowered herself beside the heater, and the cubs pressed into her belly, her chest, her neck, searching for the mother they had nearly lost. Atlas stood over them for one final moment, then slowly sank down across the doorway. Guarding, still guarding. Owen stood in the doorway, radio in hand, watching the family breathe together. Then he pressed the button. No immediate threat, he said quietly. Request wildlife recovery team, not removal. Injured, protected animals contained and stable. Caleb looked at him. Owen gave a small nod. They've had enough taken from them tonight. By sunrise, the storm had moved east, leaving the hills washed clean and silent. Grace sat in a chair, too tired to speak. Owen waited outside for the recovery team. Caleb sat on the floor near the heater, mud on his clothes and scratches across his hands. Across from him lay 9 wild hearts, 1 exhausted father, 1 wounded mother, and 7 tiny lives that had survived because love refused to leave anyone behind. Atlas opened his eyes and looked at Caleb. There was no roar, no grand gesture, just one slow blink from a lion who had carried his whole world through the dark and trusted a man to help him bring it home. Caleb's throat tightened. I know, big guy, he whispered. They don't belong to me. The smallest cub curled closer beneath Nala's chin. Caleb smiled through the ache in his chest. "But until they're ready to go home, I'll keep them safe." And for the first time in years, the old rescue room did not feel like a place Caleb had abandoned. It felt like the place he had been meant to return to. This story reminds us that the wild is not something to fear without understanding. Animals may not speak our language, but they feel danger, protect their young, and fight for their families in ways that can move the human heart. Atlas did not come to Caleb because he was tame. He came because survival had pushed him to the edge, and trust became the only bridge left. And maybe that is the lesson this little family leaves behind. Compassion does not mean owning the wild or forgetting its power. It means respecting it, protecting it when we can, and remembering that every living creature has a place, a family, and a story worth caring about. If this story touched your heart, please leave a simple 0 in the comments. If you believe animals deserve our patience, kindness, and protection, leave a 1. Even one small comment helps this community grow and lets me know you were here until the very end. And if you would like to hear more emotional wildlife stories about courage, trust, rescue, and the powerful bond between humans and animals, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. This video is a fictional, original wildlife rescue story created for storytelling, educational, and inspirational purposes. All scenes are illustrated with AI-generated images and are not real footage of an actual event.